This is a through housing joint, and it's used in a range of different things for making carcass construction. So it could be used for making something like a bookshelf or in your kitchen cupboards. And it involves cutting out a slot in one of the pieces of wood, and then the other piece fits in like that. And it's called a through housing joint because we've cut the joint all the way through, so you can see it at both ends. To mark out our through housing joint, we're going to need a steel rule for measuring. We're going to use a tri-square for drawing our lines at 90 degrees. And we're going to use a marking gauge for marking the depth. First of all, I'm going to take my steel rule and I'm just going to measure the position of the housing joint I want. So I want my housing joint to start 30 millimeters or 3 centimeters in from the side of the bit of wood. So I'm going to use my ruler, line up at the 0, move into the 3 centimeters or 30 millimeters. I'm going to make a little mark. I'm then going to take my tri-square. I'm going to make sure the long part of the stock is touching the long part of the bit of material, the wood. Take my pencil, I'm going to pop it in the line that I've measured to, slide it along, and I'm going to draw my first line at 90 degrees. Then I'm going to measure the width of the joint. Now we could either measure it, or I'm going to take the bit of wood that I know I want to slot in, which is actually the better way of doing it, and I'm going to use that to mark the width of the joint I want to create. But I'm still going to use my tri-square to mark the line at 90 degrees. Once I've got my 2 parallel lines at 90 degrees, these are going to be my shoulders. I'm going to take it and I'm going to project down the sides so that I get nice vertical lines when I'm cutting out the housing joint. I'm going to do the same on the other side. So I've used my tri-square for marking out most of the housing joint. Now I just need to mark the depth. I'm going to take my marking gauge, which I've set to 9 millimeters, which is half of this thickness of the material. And I'm just going to use that just to mark the depth on one side. I'm keeping it on the same face, so it's the same depth. I'm going to mark the depth on the other. And then once I've done that, I'm going to take my pencil and just darken in a bit. And then good practice, I'm then just going to hatch out the waist. Right, next part of cutting this through housing joint is I'm going to do something called knifing and notching, which means I'm going to use a craft knife here. Should really be a cutting knife. I'm going to put it on the line that I'm about to cut. I'm going to slide the tri-square up till it touches the knife, and I'm going to drag it backwards a few times. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm trying to cut a slot in the wood about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters deep, and I'm severing all the wood structure, so I'm cutting it rather than tearing it with a saw. So this makes sure I get a nice neat cut when I start cutting. So I'm going to pass the knife over this about 10 times, and I've cut all the fibres of the wood. I can now take my bevel edge chisel and I'm going to do something called notching, and rather than take the whole chisel and trying to take a bit out, I'm going to do just a little bit of chisel at a time, not too slopey at an angle. I'm going to make it roughly 45 degrees, a couple of millimeters back, and I'm just going to push into the bit of wood, and I'm going to use it to remove a little notch at one side, working my way along. Just take the back of the chisel and just take that little bit there, and then I've just got a little groove that I can rest my saw in. Now I've knifed and notched both sides. I can now take my tenon saw, and making sure the line I'm going to cut down to is just above my vise, so I don't cut the jaws of the vise. I'm going to put the tenon saw in the groove for the knife and notching, and then just rest my hand on the desk. I'm going to gently begin to start cutting, and when the saw begins to cut, I now need to just concentrate on making sure I'm going to cut nice and straight, and this down the side of the joint, and it's already going to be straight across the top. I'm just going to cut it from the other side to make sure it's down to the right depth, at the front and the back. it's important we want to be just a line on the one side and the same on the other side. Put the saw in the groove, begin to saw gently. Make sure it's important that you get both saw cuts right down to the line you want to cut the depth of the through housing joint. Now to remove the waste from our through housing, I'm going to take a bit of time and I'm going to make sure I want to cut down to this line with my chisel. I'm going to line up that line with the top of my vise on both sides. And that means that I can't possibly go too deep. Then I'm going to take my chisel, I'm going to hold it round that way, so it's constantly working its way out of the material. And then I'm just going to use the chisel to remove the waste material from the middle on one side. And then I'm going to flip it around, I'm going to do it to the other side to make sure that the depth on both sides is nice and neat. You can see as I'm using the chisel, it's continually working its way out of the wood, so it works its way up to a peak. Now I'm going to turn the chisel at a little sharper angle. I'm just going to use that to remove most of the waste from the bottom. And now that I've removed most of the bottom, I'm now going to turn the chisel around the other way. I'm going to line up on my vise, pressing down firmly at the top of the chisel, and I'm just going to use it to pare away the bottom. And I use the chisel to work in from one side to just about the halfway. Then take the chisel and work in from the other side. And if you get any of these little raggedy bits, because the saw's not went quite deep enough, use the edge of the chisel just to remove these, so you keep the edges nice and neat. I'm just going to take out the last little bit here. Again, I'm just lining it up with the depth of that I want to remove. Any raggedy bits, use the chisel just to break them off. And then the last bit, just use the edge of the chisel to run it down the corner to keep this nice and neat. And then hopefully this bit will go in there and we've got our through housing joint.